This document sort of lays out the possibility that you could appoint people who, not only have partisan views, but also don't have any scientific background. That should scare everybody.
On August 7th, 2025, the White House issued a relatively unusual executive order aimed at massive reform of federal research investment. The order made the argument that many taxpayer dollars given out by the federal government to fund grants and research is spent on projects that don't, in their words, improve American lives or advance American interests, and that much of the money simply wasn't spent properly. Then, in May, the Office of Management and Budget released a more than 400-page report detailing the plans to implement that 2025 executive order. Among the proposed changes, giving political appointees powerful discretion over which peer-reviewed scientific proposals would be funded. Nearly 500,000 public comments were submitted, with about 95% opposed to the rule change, according to analysis published by StatNews. While the situation is evolving, the administration has said it intends to put the proposed rules into effect on October 1st, 2026. I'm Derek Angus, a physician and senior editor at JAMA, and today I'm having a healthy dialogue with Jeremy Berg about the state of biomedical research funding in the US. Jeremy is not only a dear friend, but also one of the world's great chemists, as well as the former editor-in-chief of the journal Science and a former director of the National Institute of General Medical Sciences at the National Institutes of Health. I could not think of a better person with whom to discuss this topic. We're going to dig into what these new proposals might mean for scientific and medical research, and also take a look at the history of research funding in the US and what we as a country, a society, and humanity at large have gained. Welcome to Healthy Dialogue, Jeremy. It is great to see you.
Oh, it's nice to chat with you as well, Derek. Yeah, no, I remember meeting you at NIH back when we were deciding whether to fund at sort of the first big clinical trial that the Institute ever funded, which you were the PI of. So it's been a long time, and it's been great getting to know you here in Pittsburgh.
So there's lots to talk about here. I think maybe before discussing what's been happening in the last couple of years, why don't we just start by laying out some sort of basic facts. Could you just tell me what the traditional role has been of the US government in funding research in general and biomedical research in particular?
Sure. Before World War II, the government did fund science to some degree, but it was very much contracts and directed projects where the government knew they needed something in particular, and they would seek out investigators who had the expertise that they wanted for the problem that they knew they wanted to try to address. And then things changed as the war ended. So there was a guy named Vannevar Bush who was a MIT engineer who was a big advisor to the government during World War II, involved with
the Manhattan Project.
The Manhattan Project, proximity fuses, lots of things. I mean, he was a sought-after advisor and also given a lot of power to make a lot of these decisions. And he was also a fairly clever bureaucrat in the sense that he realized that as the war was wrapping down, that there needed to be a vision about what to do about funding science after the war, where the context was very different. And he asked President Roosevelt to ask him to put together a committee to write a report about how to fund science in peacetime. And as far as I can tell, he never asked anybody else. He just wrote the report himself. And then President Roosevelt had died by the time the report was done. And he gave it to President Truman and said, here's the report that I wrote that President Roosevelt asked me to write. It's called Science, the Endless Frontier. And it presented this very, at the time, sort of striking, unusual vision. And that was what the government should do is not targeted research. That was useful in wartime, but what he discovered with the Manhattan Project and other things was that university researchers had discovered stuff along the way, usually in completely different contexts, that turned out to be exactly what they needed to know when they were doing something applied. So he said, let's just do that on purpose. So let's just let university scientists and engineers propose ideas about things that they thought were interesting and important, and the government will fund them, after a competitive process for picking out the most worthy things among the things that come in. And you couldn't tell which ones would be important, but it was sort of a portfolio approach where if you funded 100 projects, the government wouldn't have any idea which ones of those would be important, but a few of them would turn out to be really important to drive programs in the government or in industry where they would discover things that just were needed to be known even before anybody knew they needed to know them. And that was the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, already existed at that point, but this became a framework for how they approach funding going forward. It also led to the creation of the National Science Foundation, which was created in, I think, 1950, sort of based on this model.
So, in other words, the government would still spend money on problems that they knew had to be fixed. So, for example, if there was a measles outbreak, they would know they would need to spend funds through the CDC or whatever on, gosh, we have to fix the measles outbreak. But beyond that, Bush had this notion that there could be really important ideas, and we as bureaucrats at the government, we might not be smart enough to know what these ideas are. But a fundamental driver of economic prosperity can be taking a small portion of our funds and making it available to ask scientists, what do you think you want to study? Because every so often that would yield unexpected benefits that would actually be really important for the overall prosperity of the nation.
Right. I think that's right. And I think also he appreciated that sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So a scientist would discover something and it would just change how everybody thought about entire problems or entire fields. And so that would sort of accumulate over time where somebody would discover something and somebody else would say, oh, well, given that, then we could do this. Sort of over time, it would accumulate into new solutions to existing problems or entirely new technologies in fields and sectors in the economy. In terms of return on this, it was a pretty unusual notion at the time. I think a lot of people still resist the idea that untargeted research is more efficient for getting answers than targeted research is, because it is kind of counterintuitive. But it has paid off so many times in so many ways over the 75 years since this report was written that the United States has been unusual in that it's taken this approach and has gotten huge benefits in terms of progress for the economy, progress in biomedicine in terms of new treatments and cures and approaches to things, technologies that have nothing to do with biomedicine or don't seem to have anything to do with biomedicine, like the internet, which actually turns out to have a lot to do with biomedicine, just that's not what it was invented for. So it's been amazing.
And of course, this notion of accepting that a lot of scientific advancement, which in turn drives economic advancement, does often stand on serendipity. That some of the biggest medical breakthroughs were entirely serendipitous. Statins were essentially discovered by people looking at fungi and looking for an antibiotic. And of course, NASA, trying to solve problems, invented Gore-Tex, which ended up doing many more things for many of us. As someone in Scotland, it revolutionized going hiking in Scotland. Had nothing to do with space travel.
Yeah, I mean, even if the problem sort of seems like it might be connected to things, the answer doesn't. So, I mean, one of my favorite examples, which I sort of got a chance to witness up close and personal. So I was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins and got to know Ham Smith, who was an MD, but a microbiologist who was fascinated with the question of why some bacteria are resistant to viral infections, bacterial viral infections, and others are not. So he just tried to say, well, can I figure out what's special about these bacteria that are resistant compared to other ones? And he got to work and started doing genetics and biochemistry and discovered that the bacteria that were resistant had these things called restriction enzymes that would cut up DNA So it wouldn't cut up their own DNA because they had special other tools that would sort of mark their own DNA to protect it. But if a virus came in and injected foreign DNA into the cell, these restriction enzymes were little scissors that would go around and clip it up into pieces and keep the virus from infecting the cell. So it was a really cool solution to the problem that evolution had come up with. And at the time, sort of an interesting discovery. But he had a colleague named Dan Nathans, who was also an MD, who said, the ability to cut up DNA in particular places could be a really useful tool for like mapping genes and things like that, which were questions that everybody had identified as questions, but no one really had a good idea about how to solve them. And that became the underpinning of what we now refer to as genetic engineering. And so on, those tools were the first real tools that made gene splicing possible. And the whole biotechnology industry didn't exist. And it was because of that tool and other things that were discovered just by doing fundamental research on how bacteria replicate their DNA that led to the biotechnology industry, which is now a $3 trillion industry that employs a couple of million people in the US. So no one could have foreseen that, but it happened. And, you mentioned serendipity. I mean, Ham he just passed away recently. He was a wonderful guy, very unassuming, sort of big, burly Midwesterner who was definitely not on anybody's list of obvious superstars. He's a bright guy. But one of my favorite stories that he tells was when he won the Nobel Prize, his parents were driving together and they heard on the radio that Hamilton Smith from Johns Hopkins had shared the Nobel Prize. And his mother turned to his father and said, I didn't realize there was another Hamilton Smith at Johns Hopkins.
Totally believable. Totally believable. Now, this idea of devoting some portion of your portfolio to ideas that may or may not pan out isn't limited to biomedical research. Google is well known for 20% time rule, encouraging engineers to spend about 1 day per week working on personal side projects that might end up benefiting the company. Bell Labs is another famous and successful example. But these are companies with comfortable revenue streams spending their own money. When it comes to federally funded research, it's the government spending taxpayer money. And so it stands to reason that the government would want to ensure that that money is well spent. So when we look at NIH funding, there's a couple of things to consider. First, the total amount money spent on research, and then second, how that money is spent. For the total amount, it's around $50 billion. That sounds like a big number, but that is only 3% of the $1.7 trillion the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is spending on federally provided healthcare. And so 3% is a pretty reasonable proportion of total federal spending as a so-called R&D budget, a research and development budget. But that still leaves the question about how we spend that $50 billion and whether we are getting our money's worth.
I think Mary Lasker, who was a private citizen who pushed for eventually the war on cancer, her comment was, if you think research is expensive, try disease. And I think she got it right. I was a young department chair at Hopkins Medical School in the late 80s, early 90s, and AIDS had emerged in the 80s, early 80s, as this new disease that was ravaging, first the gay community and then moving into the general population. And it was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I think it was 1993. I was in a chairs meeting at Hopkins Medical School, and it was a special meeting that was called, and I was still a very young basic science chair, and all these sort of leaders of academic medicine were around the table, and the topic was, do we need to build a new hospital to take care of the non-AIDS patients? Because the people were looking at the graphs of the number of cases, and there were no good treatments, and there were a lot of people.
It was going to overrun the country.
It was going to overrun the entire healthcare system. And I remember sort of just, I'm sure the look on my face was sort of just wide-eyed, going like, wow, this is, welcome to the big leagues. This is a little much. And, there was serious discussions. And then a couple of years later, the first protease inhibitors were developed and the first combination antiretroviral therapy were developed, and the clinical trial results came in and they worked. And, all the drug resistance problems seemed to be defeated. And all of a sudden, within a few months, this is now a treatable chronic disease that it's not going to have a 100% fatality rate anymore. And we can keep people out of the hospital and keep them pretty healthy, relatively speaking, which was both great for the affected people, but also mean the healthcare system wasn't going to collapse. So that was the consequence of a broad government funded, but also driven by the pharmaceutical industry effort to try to tackle this huge problem.
And so that would be an example of doing a little bit of reprioritization of the funds available to try to stimulate some targeted research in addition to ongoing.
Well, it was both targeted and not targeted. I mean, it was targeted research in the sense that there were certainly people working on drug development. But one of the things that the federal government did in that space with regard to HIV was say we just need to understand everything we can about this virus and how it interacts with human cells. And that has continued even after this transition of AIDS into a much more treatable disease. And within the last year, there's a new drug that was against a completely different target that was on nobody's list of anything even possible. That is another game changer. It's a drug that you can get one injection every 6 months, and it prevents making HIV transmittable. So it's a combination of focusing on a real current acute problem, but also not giving up on the fact that continuing to accumulate knowledge is going to pay even more benefits going forward. It's a question of portfolio management in the sense that you want to have some research that is toward the sorts of things that you would like to see, which is providing evidence for things that we're doing or think we should be doing and don't really know whether they're the right thing or not. And we would like to get a better evidence base for that. And if we're doing it right, be more comfortable with it. And if we're doing it wrong, rethinking it. But also having some substantial percentage of the portfolio, which is still on this more untargeted, curiosity driven, interesting problems, but it's not clear exactly what the role is yet researched.
So you need a balanced portfolio, and there are certainly endless discussions to be had about exactly how to achieve the proper balance. But in your role, when you were at the NIH, did you think the system ran perfectly, or could it use improvement?
Absolutely not. I absolutely did not think it ran perfectly. I was very interested in trying to improve it. And we actually did a few experiments, and some of which worked and some of which didn't. One standard pet peeve is that NIH peer review is too risk averse, that they will always favor a sort of incremental safe idea over a potentially really important but riskier idea. I've come to agree that that's right. And it's just inherent in human behavior in the sense that the overall quality of the proposals that come in is very high. So it's not like a choice of funding crappy incremental stuff versus funding some wacky idea. It's really good stuff.
Which one do we choose when they're all pretty good?
Right. One thing that I think works is, again, it's sort of active portfolio management. You sort of accept the fact that standard peer review is going to be pretty conservative. And then you set up a special program. And, the first was the NIH Director's Pioneer Award, but there are other programs as well that are intentionally high risk, high reward programs. And the review process for that is different. And in particular, if somebody says, this is a great idea, it's absolutely going to work, that should be the kiss of death for that sort of funding. Because if it's a good idea and it's absolutely going to work, it should be in the other pile. And what you want is, if this works, it would be a really big deal, but I don't think it's going to work. And that, I think, has worked fairly well. And I personally think it should be scaled up beyond where it is now. So you've got more of that going on. Some of that was done actually by the bureaucrats that everybody likes to criticize. So when I was at NIH, we had at that point, he was a division director, but he was a program officer who had a real sense of what problems were important. And they had a proposal from a chemist at Yale who was a gas phase ion chemist who thought he had some ideas about how to do mass spectrometry on proteins, which was a way of basically be measuring the molecular weight of peptides and proteins, which is going to be a real game changer if anybody could figure out how to do it. People had tried and no one had figured out how to do it. And this proposal came in and it got like a 60th or 70th percentile, which basically means it was completely unfundable. And this program officer said, this is a really important problem. I've read lots of proposals about this. This seems like it's as good or better than anything I've seen. The proposal itself isn't great, but this guy knows what he's doing and knows what you need to know to do this, which is gas phase ion chemistry, which is not sort of standard biomedical stuff. So he actually asked the advisory council to give the institute permission to fund this proposal despite its terrible score.
He asked for permission to fund something that got a 70th percentile.
Right.
When the normal funding line would have to be sort of like 12th percentile or higher.
Well, at that point, it was probably 25. But yeah, it was.
So he wanted to go way outside the lanes.
Right. And I think he was sufficiently concerned about covering his rear end that I think not only did he ask permission, I think he asked them to require him to fund it so that it wouldn't be.
So that it couldn't come back to bite him.
So with that process, the application was funded, and I think it was 13 years later that the investigator got an all expenses paid trip to Stockholm to pick up his Nobel Prize for helping develop protein mass spectrometry. So I think more of that would be good. The problem with high risk stuff is it's risky. I mean, ideal high risk portfolio, most of it fails. I mean, that's Silicon Valley is if more than 10% of your investments are working, you're not doing it right because you're not taking enough risks. But that's very hard to do unless you do it intentionally.
So against this backdrop, when the administration issued the August 7th executive order entitled Improving Oversight of Federal Grant Making, with an opening statement saying essentially that many research dollars are not serving us well, that might be true, but is that a feature rather than a bug in the system? Are there inherent inefficiencies in any portfolio management? Presumably there are. Every stock doesn't pay off. Not every venture capital investment hits it big, and not all research proves valuable. But presumably, if you're not taking your chances on some projects, some of which don't actually work out, then maybe you're not actually doing your job properly. So certainly there are always ways to improve the system, but I get the sense that you're a little bit alarmed by the administration's proposals.
Not a little bit alarmed, a lot alarmed. I think a lot of the statements are not made in good faith. And, I think it's easy to criticize, so NIH funds a steady state of sort of in the vicinity of 50,000 grants. You can go through a list of 50,000 things and find some that sound really dumb, either because they are or because they sound silly, even if they're not silly. I'm sure if you wrote a proposal about studying Gila monster venom to try to treat diabetes, if you read that title, you would say, this is crazy. What are they doing? But obviously, there was a good idea in the middle of all that.
Yes, of course. The story of how researchers discovered the hormone extendin-4 in the venom of the lizard known as the Gila monster, leading to the development of the first GLP-1 drug. You could absolutely imagine reading some title about studying Gila monster venom and thinking, okay, surely that is a complete waste of resources without any idea about what it might lead to. Surely the folks behind these proposed funding changes are aware that some silly-sounding research proposals will lead to important discoveries.
So I think it's the lack of good faith. And personally, I think the reality of what's going on is that, and Russ Vaught, who's the head of the Office of Management and Budget, has been pretty plain spoken about this, that his concern really is that universities are participating in things that he has political and social objections to. And the science funding is a giant amount of leverage on the universities. NIH invests about $36 billion a year in universities and academic medical centers around the country. And the Trump administration has demonstrated that they are perfectly willing to use that as a way of putting pressure on institutions by just withholding funding, or either terminating grants, at least temporarily, in the case of places like Columbia and Harvard, or just not paying the bills, which is what they did in Northwestern. People would submit requests for reimbursement through the Treasury Department, which is normally a 3-day turnaround, and they just wouldn't get paid. And they were losing tens of millions of dollars a month that they were owed. They just weren't being paid, and they weren't being told why they weren't being paid. So I think there's a strong case to be made that this was not a good faith attempt to really reform the system. I would be perfectly happy to engage in a good faith discussion about how do we improve NIH so that its portfolio is better matched to the needs of the current situation, and the organizational structure is looked at and adjusted if there's really enough bang for the buck for doing a reorganization. But calling it out and saying this is a disaster, this money is not being well spent, we need to tear the whole system down in order to fix it, I think is disingenuous and is going to be very damaging.
So maybe it'd be useful just to talk about what the broad set of actions seem to be. My understanding is one is the total amount of dollars. And so one point there was talk about capping the indirect rate, this notion that indirects were helping just give essentially huge amounts of petty cash to university leaders to spend money any way they want, and that they would then use it to spend it in promoting things that were less related to the science and more related to a political agenda apparently held by the leaders of those universities with which the current administration had an objection. Another thing related to the total spend is just a sort of sluggish go slow. We said we're going to give you the money, but we just don't we just delay giving you the money. And so that's effectively functioning like a cut because all of these universities have payroll. And then the other is something about what it gets spent on, this notion of not a quantitative effect on the dollars, but a qualitative effect. In other words, trying to redirect what kind of research ought to be funded. My understanding is that they've decided to walk back from capping the indirects. So there was lots of hullabaloo about that. But after much to and fro, that's maybe now not going to happen.
Well, so I would put it a different way. I mean, it was illegal. And it was very clearly illegal from the moment they tried to do it. The indirect cost reimbursement system was developed in law back in the 1960s. And Congress is the one that writes the rules about how indirect cost rates are negotiated. And Congress can change them if they want to, but the administration can't change them without Congress.
And indirect's a real thing. It's a real cost to the university. So it's if I walked into a McDonald's and wanted to order a hamburger, and I said, but I only wanted to pay for the actual meat, and maybe I would pay for the toasting, but I didn't want to pay for the fact that you had built a building in which there was a kitchen. And I didn't want to pay for the person that was employed to carry the food forward from the back kitchen. All those sort of things that are not necessarily ascribed to my particular hamburger, but have to be in place so that hamburgers can be made.
Yeah, no, I mean, indirect costs are exactly what you say. I mean, they're real costs. You can't do research without labs and buildings that are heated and air conditioned and cleaned and libraries and all that stuff. And, unfortunately, I think there were huge mistakes made. And first off, the name indirect costs, was just a very unfortunate choice because it really sounds like a slush fund. Universities and the powers that be did a very bad job explaining it to anybody. So, one way it played out is actually very illustrative. So when this was still being discussed, the champions who emerged were maybe a little bit surprisingly Senator Katie Britt from Alabama. Certainly not somebody who would anybody describe as a sort of bleeding heart liberal, but she understood because she talked to people at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, that the indirect costs were real. And if they capped the indirect cost rate the way they were proposing to, it would really, really damage and maybe destroy the University of Alabama in Birmingham,
a major employer in the region,
which is the largest employer in the state of Alabama and the largest provider of good jobs in the state of Alabama. So it would have been a disaster. So she said basically, whoa, you claim you're going after, Harvard and Yale, but you're going to ruin UAB. So don't do it. It was nice to see people who understood the consequences and I think the bad faith nature of this, who sort of stood up and say, wait a minute, we need to slow down here and get it. Maybe there's ways to reform the system, which is fine, but let's make sure they're based in reality of the real cost of doing research.
The other thing that got a lot of people talking when in the May announcement from OMB, and of course it's a huge report, and so it's like 400 pages. People are sort of working their way through it. But in that report, one thing that really seemed to make the headlines was this concern of the role of political appointees, which I couldn't help but think of The Hunt for Red October. With the role that Tim Curry plays as the Communist Party officer who is on board and Sean Connery is trying to work out, I'm the technocrat who knows how to sail the submarine, but now I have this political officer who's sort of double guessing my every move. And maybe I'm being too flagrant in my analogy, but when I heard the term political appointee...
A couple of things, so NIH has been relatively, historically, no longer true, but historically there have been two political appointees at NIH, the NIH director and the director of the National Cancer Institute, which is just for historical reasons, the two presidential appointees. So they have to be appointed by the administration, approved by the Senate, confirmed, and then they go in. All the others, so my role as an institute director, I was a civil servant. I was still appointed by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and I realized that my position as an institute director was at his pleasure. So they could decide for a good reason or for no reason that I was no longer appropriate to be an institute director, and that could change. And I was aware of that, not particularly worried about it, but I was aware of that. The problem with having more purely political appointees is, it's a continuum. You could make a political appointee who's a great scientist, and some of the NIH directors have been absolutely fabulous scientists and leaders who, I worked originally for Elias Zerhouni, who was appointed by George W. Bush, who was a great radiologist and a wonderful leader. And, he was definitely appointed by the George W. Bush administration and definitely had to deal with the administration and so on. But I think it was very much an appreciation for almost everything that the administration was best served by making the NIH the best it could be. And his job was to do that. I mean, there were some issues like, at the time, human embryonic stem cells was a very sensitive political topic because of their connection with abortion policy and so on. And that was a complicated issue for NIH and Dr. Zerhouni to sort of navigate the political concerns with the scientific concerns and try to figure out where the best answer lay. But by and large, most issues were not politicized any more than they had to be. And, I think what's concerning about the current document is over the past year, there have been statements in executive orders and so on, things like health in the gay community is no longer a priority. So grants that had to do with specific health concerns in vulnerable populations in the gay community or the transgender community or some minority communities have been deemed to be politically driven, and the NIH director used the term ideological boondoggles. He used that term to me rather than being good faith efforts to serve the entire American population. And that, for reasons that I mentioned earlier, really sort of hit me hard because when AIDS, going back to my roots in science, when AIDS emerged in the gay communities in New York and LA and San Francisco, President Reagan did not say anything that this disease existed for 4 years after it was being identified by the CDC and so on, and was becoming a big problem. There was no money set aside for it. It was just not talked about. The original name was gay-related immune deficiency, so it was identified as a gay condition. And that just, the caused the country to not take this seriously. And it's hard to believe that that delay did not lead to this spreading more widely into the blood supply, into the IV drug abusing community, and into the general population. So not only were gay people sort of sentenced to death unnecessarily because of this, the whole population was affected because of a clearly politically driven decision about what should be prioritized for funding. So I think it's just a bad idea from a public health perspective.
Now, my understanding is that part of the reason their argument for political appointees is that political appointees more closely reflect the people that have just been voted in. And if it's not a political appointee, it's part of the so-called deep state. And to a certain extent, that's a bureaucrat acting without necessarily being beholden to the people in the same way. There isn't the same transparency. And so if bureaucrats are truly apolitical and are simply serving the people in general, then one would say, well, they're apolitical. This isn't a political process. They're hired for their knowledge of how to administrate what is a technocratic set of activities. But I get the impression from Project 2025, which arguably a lot of these things coming from OMB is from that roadmap, is that part of their ideologic position is that the deep state, the technocrats and the bureaucrats working in the federal government are in fact political themselves and that they're predominantly left-wing. And so this is less about political versus apolitical, but more about the whole thing has become political, and not just political, but partisan. And so they want to put their thumb on the scale on behalf of the people that they feel elected them. And so then I guess this last thing is, do you feel offended at this notion that the deep state is labeled as an instrument of the left wing and is not executing its job in good service of the American people?
So I would make two completely different lines of argument. One is my experience, having been inside the belly of the beast, is that the deep state people are really very apolitical. I mean, they have their own personal political views. I just don't remember not a single discussion where any political aspect, as opposed to scientific aspect of a topic, was ever brought up, let alone determinative. That's just not how people thought about things.
And then N of one is someone who's never held a government position, but who has spent a million years sitting in study sections or dealing with, feels like an almost innumerably long list of agents of the federal government. I have to say, I don't think I've ever been, ever, in a meeting or a conversation that ever had a whiff of any political position. I don't think I could even tell you who people voted for. In my career, I have never sensed that any of these processes are political.
The other aspect is there is another branch of government, Article 1, Congress. Congress appropriates the budget every year. Congress appropriates budgets. They distribute, in the case of NIH, individual appropriations to each institute. So they can decide to spend more on the National Institute on Aging in the past because of basically a political decision that they had heard from their constituents that they are concerned about the aging population, that the baby boomers are now getting old. And, to the extent that that's a political force, they're very worried about getting old and getting Alzheimer's. And there is a very direct political connection with the people from elected officials from Congress. They also, in addition to the appropriations, with every appropriations bill, there are pages and pages and pages of what's called report language, which is not legally binding, but it basically says, we are very concerned that your institute is not spending enough on X, Y, or Z, or that you did this one thing. And from my time at NIH, you take that very seriously because Congress is expressing their concerns, which is from their constituents. So from a matter of doing your job, you need to be responsive. And also, if you piss off the appropriations committee, they tend not to appropriate the amount of money that you think would be optimal for the agency. I mean, I think that's one upside down part of all of this. So getting at the sort of motivations of the administration, the original proposal for the budget for fiscal year 2025 from the Trump administration was a 41% cut for NIH, which would have been devastating. I mean, it's almost unimaginable.
There would be meltdowns at not just UAB, but at universities big and small.
You wouldn't fund any new science at all. So they made it very clear that they were not trying to tweak the enterprise. They were trying to dismantle it or at least damage it tremendously. Congress didn't go along with that. And they appropriated the full, actually more than the amount for the previous year, more or less the same amount. So the president's executive branch had their say. They proposed the president's budget. Congress said, no, we're not going to do that. And that's a measure of the will of the people, because every senator and congressman on the Appropriations Committee had many emails and communications from their constituents saying, please do not cut health research by a draconian amount. We need you to help our parents, help our kids, help deal with all the health problems that we currently have or the ones that we're going to have in the future. So I think the lack of connection with the will of the people is a false flag. I mean, I think, the direct connection is with Congress, who are elected every 2 years, not every 4. And they come from every district. So they're representing particular constituencies. The NIH mission is to help improve the health and longevity of the American people now and going forward. And that means everybody, not just select groups. And it also means not just this year and next year, but also we have an interest in long-term investments in the biomedical system, because we want to train people who are going to be the Derek Anguses of 10 years from now and 20 years from now and 30 years from now, or even better than Derek. So,
Won't be hard.
Yeah, right. So,
yes, I get your point. That statement, as you described the mission of the NIH, there's just nothing inherently political about that. There is a political negotiation about how the NIH gets its funds. And as you allude to, that can be constantly tweaked through Congress, through its appropriations and ad hoc at any moment in time. In contrast, inserting a whole set of political appointees several layers down inside the NIH, you think presumably would actually worsen transparency, would then be harder to understand.
An important point, too, is not all political appointees are created equal. As I've said, NIH directors are political appointees, but they're generally very accomplished scientists and physicians, and they understand the biology and the medicine, even if they have particular political views or not. And what the fear is, I think, is that if you put somebody in place who is there for purely political reasons and doesn't know the difference between a bacterium and a virus, or doesn't understand, the basics of medicine or of biology, they're going to be making decisions without any framework for understanding what they're doing. So this document sort of lays out the possibility that you could appoint people who, not only have partisan views, but also don't have any scientific background. That should scare everybody.
So on that note, Jeremy, you've laid out a bunch of things that one could be concerned about. We usually like to wrap this podcast on a positive note. So I wonder if in the midst of all of this, where are you optimistic?
So, the scientific opportunities that we have now are just breathtaking. My standard title for my talks these days is From Tale of Two Cities, the best of times, the worst of times, because it's just exactly where we are. So one story, which actually happened right on January 30th, 2025, so right at the beginning of the administration, the Food and Drug Administration approved a new painkiller that's not an opioid. This story of the development of this drug is sort of a very positive, incredibly illustrative example of what the system is capable of. So we have struggled as a country with the opioid crisis, where people get addicted to opioids many times because of the medical system. So there's been a lot of interest in non-opioid but effective painkillers. So it was a huge problem. A lot of drug companies tried to work on it and failed. And then after persistence, there was this compound that was discovered by one company that's 50,000 times more specific for one sodium channel over all the others, that worked in clinical trials against people who had bunion surgery or tummy tuck surgery where they had relatively minor post-surgical pain. I mean, still pain, and it was much better than placebo. And because of the way it works, it basically has no chance of being addictive by the same mechanisms that opioids do. This is a system where basic science followed by more applied science, followed by a lot of risk taking by companies that had the profit motive to try to develop a drug, came up with something that may turn out to be a very big deal and maybe turn out to be a way of dealing with the demand side of the opioid problem rather than the supply side, which has proven to be pretty difficult. So that makes me really optimistic that we should do more of that, not do less of it. And those opportunities are all over the place. Let's get to work.
And we still have tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of incredibly dedicated people in the biomedical research enterprise across the United States. And so the assets are still in place, and with a few tweaks, we can continue to reap the harvest for many years to come. Well, Jeremy, as always, it's a delight talking to you, even when the topic is pretty scary. You tell me all sorts of alarming things. I nevertheless learn lots. And so it's been a delight to spend time with you on the show, and thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And, there's just no topic that I care more about. So.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of Healthy Dialogue. I'm Derek Angus, and I've been chatting with Jeremy Berg about the state of biomedical research funding. This episode was produced by Shelley Steffens, Matthew O'Connor, and myself at the JAMA Network. If you have questions or comments, let us know at healthydialogue@jamanetwork.org, and we'll try to respond in a future podcast. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for Healthy Dialogue wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.